The senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, today the entire Senate, Democratic caucus, and I are introducing a resolution that simply asks the Department of Justice to do what it's supposed to do, defend the duly enacted laws of this country. This resolution shouldn't be necessary. But last year, as 19 states joined Texas in challenging the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, Attorney General Jeff Sessions refused to defend the ACA in court, and in fact filed a brief arguing that several vital protections of the law should be ruled unconstitutional, including protections for Americans living with pre-existing conditions. In making his decision not to defend a duly enacted law, Jeff Sessions himself acknowledged that he was going against a, quote, long-standing tradition of defending the constitutionality of duly enacted statutes if reasonable arguments can be made in their defense, end quote. And guess what? There are many reasonable arguments for the ACA. Even conservative lawyers who previously argued against the ACA agreed. One attorney filed an amicus brief in opposition to the Department of Justice's position, calling it dangerous, beyond the pale, and effectively usurping legislative power. The Justice Department lawyer who authored the brief opposing the ACA, Chad Radler, was just rewarded with confirmation to a lifetime position to the Sixth Circuit. In fact, Mr. Radler's circuit court nomination came on the exact same day that he filed the brief on behalf of the Department of Justice. Talk about yet another Trump nominee who auditioned for his position. The Justice Department's actions were blatantly political and had a specific outcome in mind, accomplishing through the courts what Republicans have tried and failed to achieve through the legislative process, and that is repealing the Affordable Care Act. 3 career attorneys at the Department of Justice withdrew from the case in protest of their department failing to defend the ACA. In December, a federal court in Texas sided with the Trump administration, Texas and 19 other states, in declaring the entirety of the ACA unconstitutional. Of course, this will be appealed. The Fifth Circuit, one of the most conservative appellate courts in the country, will hear the case next. The case is destined for consideration by the Supreme Court, where Trump-appointed Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh will cast 2 deciding votes on whether to uphold the ACA or cast it aside. I shudder to think which way they are likely to go. The outcome of this case will have a profound impact on virtually every American, especially the 133 million people living with pre-existing conditions. This is not a game. Lives are at stake. Without the ACA's protections, millions of Americans living with conditions as common as diabetes, obesity, heart disease, or cancer could be charged exorbitant premiums or denied insurance coverage altogether. The stakes in this ongoing court battle are incredibly high. Our resolution simply asks the Department of Justice to do its job, defend the ACA as a duly enacted act of Congress, and stand up to protect Americans living with pre-existing conditions. Although many of my Republican colleagues profess to support protections for those with pre-existing conditions, not a single one of them has signed on to support this resolution. Under new leadership, the Department of Justice can do the right thing. During his confirmation hearing, newly confirmed Attorney General Bill Barr indicated he was open to reassessing DOJ's position to oppose the ACA in court. We shall see. With this resolution, my Democratic colleagues and I urge him to re-examine the department's position, consider the monumental impact this case would have on millions of Americans, and stand up for the 133 Americans living with pre-existing conditions. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 94, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
The senator from Wyoming.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President. Madam President, I often say that I like to see when people reveal themselves. With his objection today, my colleague from Wyoming sent a clear message to Americans living with pre-existing conditions that the Republican Party doesn't care about them. I'm disappointed with his objection, but I can't say that I'm surprised. Today's action is very consistent with the Republican Party's hostility to the ACA and their belief that health care is a privilege reserved only for those who can afford it. To recap, Republicans voted dozens of times over the past 9 years to repeal the ACA in its entirety. The Senate came within one vote in July 2017 to repeal the law. One vote. The majority leader and my Republican colleagues from South Carolina and Louisiana proposed and came close to passing a bill that would have gutted the ACA and cut hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid. As part of their huge tax cut for the rich and the corporations, Donald Trump and congressional Republicans eliminated the individual coverage requirement of the ACA, driving up premiums across the country. So the assault on health care continues. The American people are paying attention, and Republicans will be held accountable. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to consideration of a Senate resolution which is at the desk, expressing the sense of the Senate that efforts to create a one-size-fits-all government-run health care system referred to as Medicare for All should be rejected. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Reserving the right to object, this resolution is a cynical attempt to divide Democrats where no division exists. The Democratic Party is united behind the principle that health care should be affordable and accessible to all. As far as I'm concerned, health care is a right, not a privilege reserved for those who can afford it. Medicare for All is one way to get to universal health care that is affordable and accessible for everyone. But it's not the only way. While Democrats are working to build on the success of the Affordable Care Act to cover even more Americans, Senate Republicans have tried time and time again to eliminate coverage for tens of millions of Americans. This is particularly evident in the president's budget, a budget that will make over $2 trillion in cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, programs that provide health coverage to 1 out of every 3 people in our country. I call on my Republican colleagues to join us to improve the ACA and expand coverage to more Americans rather than trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act time after time. It is unfortunate that my colleagues would rather offer this distraction than acknowledge that millions of Americans rely on Medicare, Medicaid, and the ACA for health care. In offering this resolution, Republicans continue to do nothing except propose cuts to all 3 critical programs. Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Madam President, I just point out that what my friend and colleague from Hawaii described to as a distraction is one of the key points of the Democrat Party. Medicare for All, they call it. It's part of the so-called Green New Deal, which would bankrupt the country, which is unaffordable, unworkable. And the fact is that this Medicare for All proposal, which so many of the Democrats have signed on to would cost a minimum of $33 trillion, and maybe a lot higher after what we hear from presidential candidate Bernie Sanders as things he wants to do going beyond just Medicare for all. We know that taxes would increase significantly under their proposal. We know that for Americans who have health insurance right now through their work, which is over 150 million Americans, they would lose that. We know that for people on Medicare, it would make their ability to use Medicare much harder. And of course, then you would get into the issue of the rationing of care, the lines and lines and times to wait. There was an article, Madam President, in the New York Times on, it was an opinion piece by David Brooks on Friday talking about why the so-called Medicare for All won't work, and he made reference to health care in Canada. Now, I'll tell you, Madam President, as a senator who is also a surgeon, I've actually operated on people from Canada in my practice prior to being a U.S. senator, from practicing in Wyoming. These are people from Canada where the health care is paid through by taxes but free, where I've taken care of people who couldn't afford to wait the amount of time it would take to get their free operation. And the article in the New York Times on Friday made reference to the fact that the waiting times is so much that after you're actually seen the primary care provider in Canada, the wait time to get to see an orthopedic surgeon is 9 months. 9 months, Madam President. That's what the Democrats are proposing, something that has given the people of Canada a waiting time of 9 months. So what we see under this Medicare for All proposal, and I had just introduced today this Senate resolution saying Medicare for All should be rejected, and it should also be a rejection of the tax increases, the loss of choice, and the long lines that will come from this Democrat-sponsored proposal of Medicare for All. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Just very briefly, I simply want to ask my Republican colleagues whether they believe that health care should be accessible and affordable for all, because apparently they do not, because they have offered absolutely nothing to make sure health care is accessible and affordable for all. In fact, they would rather have a system in their continuing efforts to sabotage the Affordable Care Act and, in fact, to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. They'd rather have a health care system where millions and millions of Americans are without health care at all. I yield the floor.